Hello, today we have got a lot to talk about because this is going to be an unbelievably complicated topic. We are going to discuss the history of the English language. But because there is such a massive amount of information to sift through, we're going to do it in super fast time using a stunningly abridged history of the English language. So before we can get into this, there's a couple of things that we need to understand. The first is that we need to take a look at our map of Europe because the history of the English language isn't just about England. It's not just about the United Kingdom, this area right here. It's also about a lot of other influences from Europe that had an effect on it. So, in order to understand the history of the English language, we also have to understand the role that the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, played on it. We have to understand the role that France played on it. And then we have to understand the role that this place right here, Italy, and more specifically the Roman Empire in Italy, played upon the United Kingdom. But it's even more complicated than that, because in addition to just these places, the United Kingdom is also not just one country, it's a bunch of different ones squished together. So, for the purposes of today, we want to focus mostly on England and to a lesser extent Wales, because that's where that's where the English language comes from. Up in the north in Scotland and also over in Ireland, those places had a very big role in the development of English language, but they did not speak English. In fact, they did not speak anything resembling the language that we might have today. What they spoke instead was Celtic or Gaelic, depending on where you're looking at. We need to keep all of these things in mind in order to make sense of what we're about to discuss. So, in addition to the places that we've discussed, one of the really important things to understand about ancient Europe was that it was not a peaceful place. It was not a particularly good place to live. Even taking into account the Pax Romana, if you're familiar with Roman history, it was an extremely short, brutish, and violent life that you'd be expected to live there. And the UK, specifically England, was no different. In addition to being occasionally at war with the tribes of Ireland, the Celts, and the tribes of Scotland, the Picts, there was also a lot of wars having to do with the Scandinavians, because Norway would often look down at England, at a place that was farther south, had more farmable land, as well as having a lot of access to resources that other places wanted, timber, gold, tin, things like that. That instead of trading, it was just faster and easier to just go down and take what you want. So so England was often at war with the Scandinavians, with Viking raiders. And we need to remember that because that's going to be really the start of a lot of things that happen, is this constant war that they're having with their northern neighbors. But that wasn't all. There was also wars that were ongoing with France and Germany. These were places that were ruled by the Franks, as well as tribes of Goths, Visigoths, Jutes, Vandals, and then the two tribes that we're probably most familiar with, the Angles, and to a much lesser extent, the Saxons. Although at this point, the Saxons and the Britons, that's where we get the name Great Britain comes from, were largely established in England. So, in addition to the constant wars that were being waged over the things that wars were normally waged over in the ancient world, everything from land to commodities to slaves and any number of other things, there was another superpower that was really, really growing at the time, which was the Roman Empire. Now, before that, people in southern Europe were aware of the existence of the land of the Celts and were aware of this land of the Britain and the land of the Saxons. And by this point, largely the land of the Angles as well. By the way, that's where we get our term Angleland or England from, is from the Angle tribe. They were aware of this. The Greeks knew about this, but they referred to it as the land of monsters, and that was the place that you were not supposed to go because your ship would likely be scuttled or destroyed. And so it was on most maps just kind of a blank area with a big red X through it. Don't ever go here or you will die. And there's a lot of really interesting history on that. But what we're focused on today is when the Romans get involved. So the Romans decided that they, in their constant conquests and expansions of these lands, going through Thrace and Gallia and all the different places above them, because these countries didn't exist at the time, and battling their way through the tribes, they eventually made their way up to England. And that's when a lot of things started to change, because before this, the language that was present in England at the time was kind of a mix of Germanic, largely from those angles that we mentioned before, but also Celtic from their wars with Ireland, and a little bit of Pictish with their war with Scotland, and then some Old Norse from their constant conquests of Norway. And then finally, we mixed in some Latin when the Romans arrived. But a lot of things changed when Rome showed up on the scene. So there's three people that we need to understand before we can really talk about what happened with the Romans. The first is Julius Caesar. This is a name you're probably familiar with for good reason. Julius Caesar was the first of the Romans to make his way to England and to make contact and start a war campaign against the English. So he went up, kind of touched on them, and really kicked off a lot of the wars that were going on, because up until this point, Rome had a lot of stake in conquering the world, at least the world as they knew it. So they were going all over as far as they could and waging war against the different tribes in order to conquer land and bring back conquest. In fact, if you wanted to get ahead in ancient Rome, this is what you had to do: was you had to go conquer some new land in the name of the Roman Empire, which is exactly one of the ways that Julius Caesar got his early career started, along with the defeat of Spartacus. But Julius Caesar had a really hard time gaining a foothold in England because it was pretty far away. A lot of the people there were battle-hardened from centuries of waging war against the Vikings and everybody else that was constantly coming over there. And so the way that he went about trying to establish a foothold is that they would go around from town to town when the Roman army would get there. They would go to the different villages, and then they would make you an offer. You can join the Roman Empire, or we can crucify you. And a couple people might try to fight off the Roman Empire, but after their entire village is crucified, people start to get the message, and they start joining over to Julius Caesar's side. So this leads to a big period of unrest where you have this new group that speaks an entirely different language comes in and is trying to take over the country, and you have some rebellions that come up. So this was largely a period of turmoil that eventually, when Caesar Augustus gets in charge, that's that middle guy, he ends up putting a stop to a lot of it by opening up trade and offering Roman citizenship to the people who agreed to join Rome. So when Caesar Augustus comes along, he decides to go about things using a different route. What he decides to do is, instead of just relying on conquest and getting people to try to join the Roman cause out of a sense of self-preservation, that he's going to use one of mutual benefit. So he invests heavily in trade within the different tribes of the area, and also he offers up a huge amount of protection for those forces that they'd been constantly battling with earlier, the Scandinavians, the Norse, as well as those of the French and German empires, the Franks and the Goths and the Visigoths, etc. So under Caesar Augustus, a lot of what was in England started to get built up. Towns like Bath and areas like that had become big strongholds and major cities in the area as a representation for the Roman Empire. And so with all these new innovations, and with the bringing of things like roads and aqueducts and the aforementioned baths to England, as well as the protection that the Roman Empire offered, England joined forces really heavily with Rome. And it worked that way for a long time. Things really started to settle down and a peace spread throughout the area. So during this time, Latin really started to kind of mix in, not super heavily, but there's still a bit of influence in the language that they were speaking at the time. Clear up until this third person appeared on the scene, the infamous Nero. And Nero, among other horrible things that he was responsible for, did his level best to run the entire kingdom into the ground. And because of this, he plunged England, Britain at the time, back into war with Rome again. This was also really exacerbated with what's called the Boadiceic Wars because he did a lot of horrible things to Queen Boadicea of Ireland. And in the subsequent wars, Rome's foothold on England had really fallen apart. So, because of this, and then the ongoing struggles that Rome was having back home with the myriad of wars and the financial difficulties that they had, it became way too expensive to try to hold on to England. So, Rome was largely forced to withdraw. That is, up until this last emperor here, Hadrian, showed up. And after everything that was going on with the Boadiceic Wars, Hadrian was forced to do something big in order to try to reestablish the foothold in England. So, what he did was he used the collective Roman resources to build a massive, massive wall across the entirety of England called Hadrian's Wall. And it essentially gave the northern part of England and Scotland to the Picts to use them as a buffer to help protect the southern part of England where he was invested in against the raids by the Norse. So essentially, we'll leave you alone up here in the north. You protect us down here in the south from the Norse, and we won't fight you on anything anymore. So that was part of it. It also had a big purpose in establishing trade routes, which helped finance a lot of the building up of England. So what does this all mean? Well, all of these things happened before Rome was eventually forced to withdraw again with the collapse of Roman civilization. And all of these confluences served to mix together to form what we would refer to as Old English, which was largely a Germanic language. So let's take a look at that and see exactly what it is that Old English is, because what you think it is likely not what the truth of it is. So first we have Anglo-Saxon, which is largely a Germanic language, and mixed with Celtic, Old Norse, and a little bit of Latin. So all of these languages came together to form the language that we know as Old English. And this was primarily what was spoken in different dialects throughout England, clear up until a big event, which we'll get to here in a second. But what we want to do now is we want to take a look at Old English and see how different it is from our modern English. So now that we understand what Old English was and how it came about, let's take a look at what it actually looked like. So what we have here is called Cadman's Hymn, which is a prayer and one of the oldest examples of the English language that we have. As you can see, it looks way different than our modern English. There's some letters in there, some sounds that we don't have. A lot of things have changed. So let's take a look and see if the pronunciation of it matches up with what you might think. So we'll go ahead and read this. Nu schulan harion, haiochen riches werde, methodus meachte on this modjadonk, werk wondervader swahe wondra jechwas, eche drekten oran stelde, he sheop e arden bernum, he oven trochrove, harie schiepend, va middenjerd montunus werd, eche drekten after theode, filum foldan freie almichtie. So there's only a couple of words in there that you might recognize. Almichtie being almighty, a reference to the gods that they worshipped, or in this case, I believe it was the Christian god. But most of these don't sound anything like our current language. They do have a very Scandinavian tone to them, which comes from centuries of warfare with the Danes and the Jutes and the Vikings and the Norse and all number of northern peoples. But it obviously doesn't sound very much like our modern English. So how do we get from here to the language that I'm speaking now? Well, there's more to it. Before we go on, though, there's a couple of things that we want to make mention of that generally come up when referring to Old English. One is the Arthurian legend, and the other is Hengist and Horsa. So after the Romans left, they left England largely defenseless and open to all sorts of people who wanted to come in and, ravage the country and raid them and, carry off their gold and treasure and whatnots. So they needed somebody to save them. This is where the legend of King Arthur comes in. Now, it's almost certainly fictitious. Even the realistic parts of it, there certainly never was a Lady in the Lake and a Lancelot and a Guinevere. Um, but the suggestion is that King Arthur was actually a mercenary that had been trained by the Romans. And once they left, he was able to scrounge together enough of a force that he was able to defend England from the invading hordes. Now, those are most certainly still inaccurate. Historically, there was very, very unlikely to have ever been a King Arthur. Then the other ones that we want to look at is Hengist and Horsa. If we look at the early people, how do we go from it being Britain, the land of the Brits, to being England, the land of the Anglo-Saxons? Well, according to legend, Hengist and Horsa were two Anglo champions from the Germany area that had come over to help England fight off the invading northern tribesmen. So, at the behest of the Britons and the Saxons, they successfully led a campaign uh, to which they were able to fight off the Norse. And they were so successful and so beloved that, depending on the version of the story, either the Angle king granted them large tracts of land in England for their people to come and move and live there in peace and harmony forever, or what seems more likely is that he refused to pay them, and then they waged war on him because they had all the swords and weapons and took most of England for themselves. But that's how we go from England being Britain to England being England. With these two pieces and with all this information regarding Old English, let's move on to Middle English. So now we fast forward to the 11th century, and here you'll see this great big list of names, and all of them are involved in this saga. So first we start with Harthacnut and Magnus the Great. So if you remember, England had long been at war with the northern countries, the Scandinavians, the Norse, and those were largely ruled at that time, by this man named Magnus the Great. There was also the ruler of England, a man named Harthacnut. And in an effort to foment peace, these two decided that they were going to come to an agreement. Should either one of them in their lineage die off without an heir, then whichever one was left that did have an heir would come to rule both countries. So if Harthacnut's great-grandchildren or whatever died before they had kids, then the entire country would go to be ruled by the Scandinavians. Fast forward a little bit farther, and you have this king of the Norse, another king of the Norse, named Rollo, who had been raiding England and had come to an agreement with a man named Charles the Simple, who was a different king of England. This was long after Harthacnut and Magnus the Great. And Charles the Simple came up with a relatively easy solution to the problem that he was facing, and how do I get the Scandinavians to quit murdering English? Well, right across the coast of England, across the English Channel, there's France. And on the edge of France is a country, or is a place, a region called Normandy. Charles the Simple, who had, through intermarriages and a lot of political intrigue, had a lot of sway in that area, gave Rollo that section of land there called Normandy, and said, you and your descendants and your armies can live here. You'll act as a buffer for the French, and in return, you leave the English alone. So everybody made out on that deal. So you have Rollo, who has come down and he's set up shop on the coast of France, and the language of the Norse had started mixing with Old French to give us a language called Norman. From there, we have yet another king of England named Ethelred the Unready. This was far in the future from that. And he got married to Emma of Normandy, who was a Norman princess. They had a child by the name of Edward the Confessor. This is where things get tricky. This is where all of these other names come in. So keep in mind, you have the Normans, and then you also have Harthacnut and Magnus the Great that had made this deal that that the original land that had already made this deal about who would get England should somebody die without a kid. So then we get into these three: Edward the Confessor, Harold Godwinson, and Tostig Godwinson. So Edward the Confessor was King of England, but he was also known for being extremely religious, so much so that he was busy in prayer more times than he was spent ruling England. And he never actually had a kid before he died. So if you remember back to that last slide, we had Harthacnut and Magnus the Great had made that deal where if an English king died without kids, that Magnus the Great's descendants would go ahead and get control of England. Well, that's exactly what happened here. But there was a lot of problems. One of the big problems was that Edward the Confessor spent more time as a kid in Normandy than he did in England because that's where his mother was from, so he lived there learning French customs rather than English customs. And while he was gone, Harold Godwinson was one of the richest men in England, owned most of the country, and had basically set himself up as king in Edward's stead. In order to do this, he had to kick out his brother, who was also vying for the throne, Tostig. So Tostig was sent into exile, leaving Harold Godwinson to essentially run the country. When Edward comes back, Harold Godwinson gives Edward back the throne because it was his rightful throne, but then Edward died. Harold Godwinson naturally said, well, as the richest person in England, the throne should go to me. I already own most of the country. Everybody knows who I am. They're loyal to me. Except for that darn deal that they made with the Norse. There was also the fact that Tostig, who had been in exile, decided that this was a good time to strike. Enter these two, Hardrada and William. So first, Tostig gathers together an army and attacks England to try to usurp the throne from Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson gathers together his men, fights off Tostig, doesn't kill him, but sends him back into exile, where he moves up to Scotland. Tostig was well aware of the agreement that Magnus the Great had made with Harthacnut, and so he connected with the Scandinavians, this guy right here, Harold Hardrada, and said, hey, by the agreement, you are supposed to be in charge of England. I've already lost my claim to the throne, so why don't I give the rest of my army to you, and you go take what's yours by force? Because Harold Godwinson was sure not going to relinquish his title as king. He'd served his duty loyally, and he was ready to collect on his reward. So, already reeling from the battle with Tostig, Harold Godwinson hears these rumors, not about Hardrada, but about a man in Normandy, a Norman king, by the name of William. Now, he's frequently referred to as William the Normandy, but he had a couple of other names as well. One was William the Bastard, because his parentage was suspect and his parents weren't married when they had him. So he, through military power rather than political connections, managed to wrestle control of Normandy away from the other people that wanted to take it from him. And if your name is William the Bastard, then you're going to do things that you, whatever you can to try to change the way that everybody else talks about you. You're going to change your name to William the Conqueror, but in order to do that, you have to go conquer some territory. And fortunately, there's a country right next to you that happens to be in a lot of pain from the war that they just got done fighting, so it looks like easy pickings. Harold Godwinson knew that William was coming for him, so he arrayed his forces along the edge of England, along the English Channel, waiting for William to come through. The problem was that most of his soldiers weren't professional soldiers, they were farmers. So September comes around, and the farmers have to go harvest their crops, otherwise the entire country is going to starve and die. So Harold decides, hey, William hasn't come so far, he's probably not going to attack during the winter, so we'll just wait. He sends his soldiers out, allows them to go home, and basically dissolves his army. This was the moment that both Hardrada and Tostig had been waiting for, because Tostig had told him that this was going to happen. So at this point, Hardrada decides to invade and take control of England and put himself on the throne, the same as their earlier agreement was. So, with his soldiers all spread out, Harold Godwinson is forced to start a war against Hardrada to try to fight him off. He ends up doing it barely. He's barely able to hold on to power. This is the moment that William has been waiting for, leading to the Smackdown of 1066. So, as Hardrada's people were up here ravaging the northern side of England and Scotland, Harold Godwinson was forced to bring his people up there, leaving this area completely undefended. This is the moment that William of Normandy had been waiting for, so he crosses the English Channel to invade England. With the very, very small spattering of troops that he had left, Harold Godwinson meets William of Normandy on the field of battle in Hastings, which is down here. This battle, as you might expect, was a complete slaughter for a couple of reasons. One, the English were using largely foot soldiers. Their cavalry, the little cavalry that they had been destroyed. They had very few bowmen. But the other reason was that the Normans had this weapon over here, the longbow, which, that given the muddy fields that they were in, had really slowed down the English and their ability to fight, and left them basically sitting ducks for the French to come in and slaughter the whole group. So after the Norman conquest of England, the people of England suddenly found themselves with a brand new leadership. Everybody that was now in charge was speaking Old French. And much like happens anytime in history where you have such a dramatic change in leadership, it creates a vacuum. And if you want to fill that vacuum, if you want to get ahead in any area, whether it's art or politics or being a merchant, whatever it is you want to do, you have to learn to speak the language of the rich and the elite, which in this case was now Old French. So these two languages, Old English and Old French, suddenly got mashed together rather violently. And so it forced a real change in the way that the language was spoken. We see this everywhere, even today. In the southern United States, you have Spanglish, which is Spanish and English mixed together. You have Creole English and Gullah, which is a mix of French and English. We even see this up in Canada, although theirs is a little bit of a different story. But this happens all the time. So what happened to the English language once this occurred? Well, we have another example of this, which is the prologue to the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. And we'll look at this here in a second, and you'll see that there's a pretty dramatic shift. Some of these words are actually pretty closely related to our current English, so you might be able to understand some of what this is talking about, even though you don't speak Middle English. So here is the general prologue to Canterbury Tales, and let's look at this opening bit here. Juan that April with his shore sota, the drocht of March hath parsed to the rota, and bathed every vine and switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fleur. Juan Zafras eke with his sweat and breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tendre croppes and the younge sonne, hath in the ram his half a course irona, and smalle fools maken melodia, that slepen all the night with open ear. So pricketh him nature in here courages, than longen folks to gon on pilgrimages, and palmers for to sick in strange strandes, to fern halwes coth in sondre landes, and specially from every sheerest ende of Ingoland to Canterbury they winde. The holy blissful martyr for to seek, that him hath holpen, than they were sick. So even if you don't understand a lot of what was said, just looking at that first line, Juan that April, we might see how that could change into our more modern English of when in April, with his shores sota, so with April showers, the drought of March hath pierced to the rota, so the drought of March has pierced to the root. So we can understand that this is just a simple shift away from being the language that we speak today. How does this happen? Let's take a look at why we don't speak this way anymore. So this leads us to the Great Vowel Shift. Now this happened between 1400 and 1700. And if you remember that last date, which was 1066, so this gives you somewhere between almost 300 and 700 years of French occupation of England. And then all of a sudden, there was a big shift in the way that people spoke. The vowel placement and the mouth changed. So if you think of those words, that first line from Canterbury Tales, Juan that April. Now we would say it as April. So those vowels have shifted from the way that we pronounce them in the back to the way that we pronounce it in the front. So this was coupled with England developing a stronger national identity. So what had once been a largely French-based language suddenly shifted again to being its own entirely separate language, which is where we get to the way that we speak now. Now, there's a lot of arguments as to why this happened. Part of it could have been because of the Black Plague had killed so many people, so it caused a mass migration, and people were suddenly exposed to new accents and new identities, whether they were Scottish or Welsh or what have you, people from the country moving into the city, people from the city fleeing to the country. Or it may also have been because of anti-French sentiments. People were tired of being ruled by the French, and they were tired of the French attitude and the way the French treated the English. So those are two of the big prevailing theories as to why this happened. But what we know is that the end result was that it led to EME, which is early modern English. This is what a lot of people think of when they hear Shakespeare. They think of that Shakespeare's Old English. That's actually early modern English. So this is where we are going to leave off for today, because when we continue, we're going to be discussing Shakespeare, who he was, and how what the works that he did led to a stronger identity for the English language, led to the shift in from early modern English to modern English, and more recently into postmodern English. But we'll go ahead and end here for today.